Hello and welcome to Unlocking the Power of RAW. I got a question for you. Have you ever wished that your RAW files could come in and just magically look better without having to touch any sliders? I do. That's the whole world of AI, people get down on that. I wish something would just make it look like it's ready for processing, right? Well, we don't really have a magic button for that, but I can teach you how to make your own magic buttons for that. What happens though is you're gonna need to do your due diligence on the front side to create these things. People ask me all the time, do you create profiles in Adobe Camera Raw? It happens in every single live event. Every live event I show, people ask me about profiles. And the answer is yes. I make a lot of my own profiles, and I've even made my own profile packs called Intelligent Profile and Presets Chroma and Noir, and even the base Intelligent Profiles and Presets. That's 3 different courses that show you this information. But I don't always use them in my workflow all the time. I use them more for case-specific things. And that's where I think that these profiles can be really powerful. But you can also be like me and be on the quest to try and make the best profile that will work for everything. Okay, so if you don't know what a profile is, let's start from the very bottom. Okay, a profile is essentially, in the past, profiles were used to help you calibrate the colors in your RAW files as they came in. But since version, I think it was like 2018 or 2019 of Photoshop, they implemented a way to create profiles that actually made a really artistic approach, or could make an artistic approach to creating your own profiles that weren't necessarily camera technical specific, but were more specific on just making whatever you want happen on your image before you even touch a slider. The premise here is you bring your file into Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, and then you put a profile on it. For the most part, you're probably working with Adobe Color because that's the default one that Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom are going to select, unless you've changed that. And what that is, it's just a way for Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom to read the image and show you the information. Some people like to use something called a linear profile, where that comes in and cuts through the original curve that is in your RAW file that makes it look somewhat decent. If you're familiar with video, a RAW file is essentially a log file. And if you've ever seen log video, it's absolutely horrendous. It's washed out, it's contrasty, it doesn't look that great. But it gives you the ability to do whatever you want to that raw footage. That's essentially what a RAW file is. But we see something as a good looking product as soon as we open it in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, because there's an initial profile that's being put on that. Essentially, you can't work without a profile in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. What is happening here is something is controlling what happens to your image as soon as it comes in. And do you want to have the most control over that is the question I'm asking you. And if that's the case, this is going to be great for you. I will say though that this is one of those nerdy times. I'm going to be doing a lot of really nerdy things in Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. Stick with me, because if you do, there will be a reward at the end. Great power. That's what you get at the end of this. Don't stick with me and, you're back to just editing like everybody else, which isn't a problem. It really isn't. This is really for people who want to dig in real deep. So let's dig in real deep. So the way I make my profiles is I typically will start with Adobe Color as the base, because that's the default that I go with. I actually don't mind Adobe Color much. I know some people have their qualms with it, but I find it does a pretty good job of rendering my RAW file for me. So I keep it at Adobe Color. The second thing I do though is I press the auto button. And the only reason why I do this is because this becomes a variable that I can control. When you press the auto button in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, it is going to try to find the best dynamic range for the image. And it's an AI-driven thing, meaning it's happening in the background. You don't even know it's doing it, but it does a pretty good job of evening out the tones and pulling things out so we can see the areas in the waterfall. If you go here, our highlights are down, our shadows are up. I would argue you could probably push this even further on the highlights to get more data out of there if you wanted to, but it's playing it safe here with the little governor that's got placed in there. So for the sake of the tutorial and for the sake of all my profiles, the variable that I remain constant as I'm building a profile is to press the auto button. That way I know with a general sense what the profile that I'm going to create could look on almost every image. Now, I will say that most of my profiles are image specific, and we'll get into that. That's why I have multiple examples for you today. And if you're an F64 Elite member, you will have access to this replay indefinitely, and you'll also get all of the profiles that I create during this live event. If you're not a member, you'll have a very short window of when you can view this replay, and you won't get the bonus profiles that I'm going to create for F64 Elite members today. So let's dive into it. So now we've got this almost set up and ready for us to go. But in order for you to understand the profile, I need you to understand the order in which the profile finds itself in your raw editing process. I tend to think that Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom work in a layered type of way. Now, you won't see layers. You'll think that everything is happening all at the same time. But there is a way that the order is read that you see here in this basic setting and also into your masking. And the priority in which Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom will read those things. The profile is at the top, but it's not at the very tippy top. And I'll go in and prove that to you in a minute. Color grading is actually at the top. So what happens here is when you use a LUT-based profile that you create, which is a lookup table, which is what we're going to create, what happens is it kind of lays on top of the image as a transparency. So then everything that happens underneath that profile is going to change the way the image looks based on the original parameters of the profile that you created. So let's go ahead and open this in Photoshop and I'll give you an idea of what we're going to build into those original parameters for this specific RAW file. Open it up in Photoshop. The idea here is that I want to get a better starting point for my colors and my tones. If you know me, I like to separate out my yellows and my greens. I like to make sure that the image looked like the way I saw it. To me, this was a little bit more red. Our yellows are a little bit on the green side. Our greens are a little bit on the yellow side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to boost the tones in this image a slight bit while also adding color to it. When I'm making a lookup table, which is what we're doing here, and a lookup table is just again, a set of parameters that's going to rest on top of our RAW file to tell Adobe Camera Raw to read these tonal values and give us this information. We cannot use masks here. Best practices coming in hot. You cannot use masks or any pixel layers. So what that means, do not duplicate anything. Don't do that. Okay, because if you do, it's going to mess everything up. Or don't add any other images in here or painted layers. That will mess up the entire process. Okay, no masks. Now, you can have an empty mask that is white, but don't fill it with white. If the adjustment layer comes in with a mask on it, it's fine. Just don't fill it with white and don't paint anything black on it. Leave it exactly the way it is. Now, what can we use? We can use blend if. We can use adjustment layers. We can use opacity. We can use fill. So as long as we don't incorporate any pixels into the image and everything remains an adjustment layer using only adjustment layer properties, we'll be fine. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a curve. Now this curve is just going to be one of your basic curves. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bit darker, okay, in the dark areas, and then a little bit brighter. Now, one could argue, well, Blake, couldn't you have just done that in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom with the curve? And quite honestly, yes, I could have done this in Adobe Camera Raw with the curve. But what if I want to use that curve for something else? You see what I'm saying here? The more we do in Photoshop right now with the tools we have in Photoshop, either the less that we have to do in Adobe Camera Raw or the more access we get to those tools because they aren't being used at the very beginning or base level of your workflow. So let me go ahead and move this curve just a little bit higher here, right about there, and that looks about good. These tones just help us get our colors set right. So now I'm going to put a selective color adjustment layer on here, and I'm going to go into the reds. Now, in the reds, I want to make them more red. I want to pull some of the cyan away from those red. I did tell you that these rocks were more red. What's holding them back? Cyan. What's also holding them back? Probably blue. So let's add a little bit of yellow to them. Okay, maybe even a little bit of magenta to them. Okay, so now our reds are going to pop a little bit more. Now we'll go into our yellows. And in the yellows, I'm going to drop the cyan out of the yellow a little bit so they get a little bit more red. I'm going to drop the magenta out of them so they get a little bit more green, and then increase the amount of yellow that's in there. One thing I will tell you that is kind of a cheater method now is that these profiles use a slider. So that means that you don't have to take these things that you're doing right here to an extreme. You can actually be pretty delicate with them. And if you incorporate the slider, which I'll show you how to do that, when you make your profile, you can use the profile to get double the amount or triple the amount of what's happening right now just by moving that slider up. So what I mean by that is you don't have to push things too far right now. So let's go into our greens. We'll polish them off with our greens. Let's make our greens a little bit more green. Let's add a little bit of cyan to those greens and take the red out of them. And then we'll go ahead and bump up our yellow in that green. So now all of our colors are a little bit more vibrant. Okay. Now I want to make a LUT or a lookup table profile from this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit. I'm going to turn the lock off on this because in order to do this, I need to export out the LUT, which is a lookup table, which is basically a series of Excel data points that say, if this tone is this, do this. If this color is this, do this, okay? So if I go ahead and go to File and go to Export and say Color Lookup Tables, I'm going to get an error message. It's like, could not export color lookup tables because this document has no background. So it needs to know what the base layer is, because right now to Photoshop, this layer could just be anything. So we need to identify that this is the set of parameters that all of these data points are going to adjust from. So what I'm going to do here is go to Layer and go to New and go to Background from Layer. That'll automatically make that a background for me. And then if we go to File and we go to Export Now and we go to Color Lookup Tables, ta-da, we're good to go. Okay, so I'm going to call this EX1, just so we know this is example number 1 from the live event. And I'm going to call this Tone plus Color. Actually, let's do it Foliage, Tone, and Color, because this is really what this is about. Foliage, Tone, and then we'll do plus Color. Now, what I like to do here is also press Control A and then Control C. That will just copy this for me. That way, as I make this profile, I don't have to type this every time. I've copied it here. What you need to do here is just all you need to do is make sure that the grid points are set to 32 and this is set to cube. This will be standard every single time you make a lookup table. Okay, so just keep this exactly like you see it here. And it's asking me where I want to save it. I'm just going to save it right into the same folder with all these images. I'll press Control V again because I already have it here. And I don't need to add the .lut at the end of it. All I need to do is press save because it knows that it's saving it as a cube anyway. And when I press save, it'll do this doubling, shrinking thing, and then it goes away. It's like, wait, what just happened? Well, what it did was if I go over to that folder, and I show it to you, and we scroll down in this folder, you'll see down at the very bottom we have our, right here, Foliage, Example 1, Cube file. Now, nothing is actually a profile yet. We have to create a profile. So what I do at this point is I open the exact same folder, the exact same image with those exact same ACR settings. So a lot of times when I'm making profiles, I will segregate those raw files into their own folder just so that they don't get mixed up with any of the other images, because I know that I'm just using them as a way to make a profile. This is kind of like a science experiment if you haven't wondered, or if you haven't noticed that already. So then what I'm going to do is I'll open this folder again and just double click on that raw file and have it open up in Adobe Camera Raw. All right, so now we know that this is already set to auto. It was set to Adobe Color. I need to make a profile from this LUT so that this image changes. So I need to go into the presets setting. Yes, we are not going to go into the profiles area. We're going to go to presets. The trick here is you press Alt or Option and you click on this thing that says preset. If you're pressing and holding Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, it will open up a new dialog. It's not a preset now. It says create profile. That's interesting. Now you wonder why Blake said unlocking raw power, because this is locked. For some reason, this is not common knowledge unless you're a nerd like me. So we'll press Control V, and now we see example 1, foliage, tone plus color. Now you'll see here, what are we including in this? You see here where it has the camera profile selected. Keep that checkbox on because that was one of our standards, okay? Now, I don't want this profile to include anything that happened with the basic adjustments or the point curve. All I want it to have is the profile and the lookup table I'm going to put in there. So keep the look table checked because that's Adobe Color. And then in that folder, it's automatically going to open it up because that's where the raw file came from. That's why I like to keep those in similar places. If I double click this, this is basically going to say, okay, we're using this color lookup table. What color space? I usually work in Adobe RGB, so let's put it in Adobe RGB. Now the gamut, keep the clip where it is and the sample set to 32. And the minimum amount here and the maximum amount, 0 means as you move the slider, this will go away completely. You're basically saying here, okay, I want this to be between 25%, let's say 25% and 200%. And the amount that it's going to start at is going to be 100%, which is basically right in the middle. So depending on the profile that you're creating, you might want to change these settings. One other thing that you might want to consider here is putting it into a group. Okay, so you could put it into your user profile, so it just goes into a user profile group. I like to put them into my experiments folder. For this one, I'm going to call this we'll call it we'll just call it unlocking raw. Okay, that way when I save this, it'll all be saved in the same place. So when I'm done with all this, when I save these out for you, as an Elite member, when you download them, all you have to do is install them into Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, and it'll go into a folder, its own folder called Unlocking Raw. We'll press OK, and then we press OK. So that's the nerdy basics on how to get this thing started. So how do we get this thing on the image now? Well, if I go back to the basic settings and go to where it says Profile, click on the Browse Profiles section. If I go into where I had Unlocking Raw, this profile is now on there. Okay, and if we look at the slider here, I can make that more powerful or less powerful. It's almost like the image is editing itself at this point because I started with a good base. Now, none of my color has changed here. This color hasn't changed. This is the only reason why the color changed here is because we pressed the auto button. Okay, but none of my colors have changed. I haven't touched calibration. I haven't touched the color mixer. I haven't touched the point color. I haven't done anything here to change what's happening with the image other than auto and my profile. So what that allows me to do is it allows me to push this image a little further. Now, because that color lookup table had some tone adjustments set into it, every tonal adjustment I make here is going to be a rather big change compared to what it would normally be at Adobe Color. And that's because that profile that rests on top, every time a slider is moved, anytime a color is changed, it is mixing. Think about that profile being like paint. It's mixing with that paint, or it's mixing with that cellophane that's on top of this to give it a different look. So you can just push things a little bit further. Now then the question is, well, will this only work on this image? Well, not necessarily, but I would say most of the profiles that I use, I try to make them generic enough that they could work on multiple images. But let's open up another image from this same data set and see how it works out. So I'll close this out, say done. I'll just double click on this raw file right here, which is essentially a closer up shot of this waterfall. If I go in here and I change this to my Unlocking Raw, and I do my foliage plus color, and I go back and I set this to auto because that's the variable that was the basis to begin with, you can see that it does a very good job even on this image, which is slightly different than the other one that came from this series. If I change this to Adobe Color with the settings that I have on here, look how it's kind of washed out. The colors aren't quite as prominent. But if I press Command or Control Z to get that back, if we wanted more out of it, we can just push that amount slider more and we start to get a really good looking image here right at the raw level. All right, so that's example number one. Let's look at example number two. In example number two, I'm going to use more of a blue sky type of image to see if we can exaggerate the blue sky while also making our foreground slightly warmer. Okay, so I'm going to say done on this one. I'm going to open up this image here, which was from a recent sailing trip that I took when I was in Squamish, Canada with my wife. Let me go ahead and reset this to the default here. Okay, so with this reset to default, let me go ahead and change my crop. I can't look at that. That's just horrible. Let's just go ahead and get that straightened out. We can use the ruler tool to make it even more perfect. All right, straighten that bad boy. Okay, so what's the first variable? I'm going to save it, leave it as Adobe Color because that's my base, and then go ahead and press Auto. Okay, now from here, I'm not going to do anything else. Just press Auto. Because again, that's going to be my variable that lets me know that this is what Adobe Camera Raw thinks is the best idea for this RAW file and for most RAW files. So any image that I bring up that has a blue sky that is kind of close to this one will have the same kind of look and feel. So I'm going to press Open. And again, now I want to make a profile for this one from adjustment layers in Photoshop. So what I want to do is I want to make the blue sky more blue. A little bit less on the cyan side, but a little bit more on the blue side, while also making sure that the foreground gets a little bit more of that yellowish color in it. This is the big problem with white balance. This image is a perfect example of white balance issues because the blue sky wants to be blue, the greens want to be yellow, but because the white balance has to choose either more blue or more yellow, it's determining that this image should be more blue, therefore our yellows are sacrificing. Well, let's make the blue more blue, the yellows more yellow, so we have a good starting point to begin with. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a selective color adjustment layer on here, and this is all going to just be selective color for everything I do. I'm going to go into the blues. Now I want to make the blues a little bit more prominent. So I'm going to increase the level of cyan that's in those blues. I don't have to go too high. About 30 is good. I'm going to increase the amount of magenta in those blues because that's also going to give that a more defined look for our blue, and then make our blue more blue. What's also included in blue is a little bit of cyan. So let's take the yellow out of our cyan and make it more blue. For the cyan here, if we make it more cyan, it's going to make our sky look not so much real. So I want to add a little bit of red to that actually, to taper down some of the cyan and make that cyan actually appear more on the blue side. And to do that, I need to force it around the color wheel a little bit more. Okay. So now all of our blues have become more blue, more defined. We could even possibly add a little bit of darkness to that cyan. You see it takes that edge off of the cyan and makes them a little bit darker. That looks pretty good. If we go into our blues, let's see what happens with the tonal value of the blue. We can even make that a little bit deeper. Okay. So that's selective color adjustment layer number 1, just for the blue sky. Okay. Now let me put another selective color adjustment layer on here that is going to be working more with the tonal values in the image to see if I can make them a little bit more warm, because this was a lot warmer here. This is at sunset. So this is actually lit up with like oranges and yellows, but because the blue sky and the blue water were a white balance nightmare. So let's go into our neutrals. Let's make our neutrals a little bit more on the warm side, just a little bit more. Okay. Let's go ahead and make them a little bit more red, just a little bit. So neutrals, you can go really far with this and take them a little bit too far if you go too much with these sliders here. So we're just going to go a little bit with our neutrals. Let's go into our whites. In the whites, let's make them a little bit more yellow. You see that we're starting to get a little bit more of that yellow here in the foreground. And again, we don't need to take this stuff too far because we're in Adobe Camera and Lightroom. We still have other sliders that we can use. So I just need to make a base for this. So I'm just making my lights a little bit more on the warm side, and I will actually darken them down a little bit too. So our whites are going to get a little bit more of a dark presence to them. We'll add a little bit more of that yellow while we're here. Now let's go into the black. Now the black, because if you look in the shadow of the black, it's getting very blue. So in the black area, let's actually increase a little bit of yellow in there. We'll put a little bit of magenta in there, and then put a little bit of cyan in there because I don't like how it gets too warm. It doesn't look like we have much difference. And then a little bit deeper. So now this selective color adjustment layer is really working with our tones, but it's warming things up while also making our colors in the foreground more accurate. Well, if we just did that, we aren't doing much to our blues in the background. This is controlling our blue. This is controlling our neutrals in our foregrounds. Now, if you really want this blue to only hit the blue, you can even do something advanced like use blend if in my blend if panel and say only blue. Okay, so now this is only going to affect those blue areas in the sky because we told it this is only going to affect blue. How this affects your lookup table is that is a data point that says, okay, when blue is affected, incorporate this blend if and make this image look like this. Okay, so let's save this one out. We're going to go to File. Again, this is already a background. We're going to go to File. We're going to go to Export. And we're going to do this as a lookup table. Now, with this lookup table, what I want this to be, I want this to be EX2. And we're going to make this blue sky. And then that looks good. We'll copy that, Control C. So when I press OK, Control V or Command V on a Mac, I'll just save it in the same place. Okay, so that's saved. We need to make a profile from it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a couple images that are very similar to this one and see how this works on some other blue sky images. Open this up in Adobe Camera Raw by just dragging and dropping my raw files in here. First things first, I'm going to make this profile and I'm going to do it on this image since it was our starting point, not changing anything. Go to the presets, Alt or Option on the presets, Control V. Group is going to be unlocking raw. We don't want basic settings. We don't want point curve. It will save these in here if you don't uncheck those. And then we'll press color lookup table. I want this color lookup table, so I'll press open and then Adobe RGB. And I don't really need to worry about the clip and I don't need to worry about the minimum and maximum. And then when I press OK, it's going to go into the unlocking raw folder. Good to go. I'll press OK. So now I'm going to hop back up in here, go over to our profiles, and then go into unlocking raw. And then here we have example number 2, which is blue sky. Again, if I move this over, look at that. It's going to make our darks more rich. Our lights are actually going to get a little bit darker also. And look at how that rainbow even comes out. And the blue sky gets more blue. That's actually pretty phenomenal because this is now the starting point for all my tones and all my colors. And as I change things up here and I modify things up here, it's going to take into account that LUT that's on top of it, the profile that's on top of it. And then see, even if I adjust my temperature settings here, you can see how it really changes pretty drastically depending on the temperature setting I choose because color is incorporated in here. Now, how does it work on a similar image from the same place that night? Well, let's see. Let's go into unlocking RAW. You don't have to do this every time. Once it's done, that's the beauty of it. You can just go to, that's example number 1. Here's example number 2. If I go back, I need to press the auto button on this because that was the first variable. Okay. And it looks like here we could possibly incorporate a little bit more of that exposure, drop our highlights a little bit, maybe a little bit more of our shadows, and then see where our contrast is there. And then this one looks like it has a little bit too much blue in it. Move this over to the yellow a little bit, and then look at how all those colors and tones come out. Now, I've just started here. If I just set this to Adobe Color, though, look at the difference. It's got that cyan color to it. If I need more out of this, again, we can always increase this. And look at how beautiful that one profile looks, especially here on that foliage area. This was from a completely different night, it was a year apart actually, in the Columbia River Gorge, almost exactly a year apart in the Columbia River Gorge, two very similar places, mind you. I'm going to click on Unlocking RAW, and then here, I'm going to do this example number 2 with the blue sky. I'll go back, and then as I edit my settings here, I haven't even done anything to the settings. If I press Auto, because that's the very first variable, look at how beautiful this profile looks on this image, especially as I increase the amount there. Now, if I press Adobe Color, it's not quite as strong, all right? Again, this is some nerdy stuff. I will tell you that. This is the nerdy stuff. This is the stuff where it's like, man, if I could only have just a little bit more, they get to a certain point in your raw processing where you're like, man, I wish there was something else I could do that could make this just a little bit better as a starting point. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to get finished images this way, because I always tell people to finish in Photoshop anyway. And people ask, okay, well, Blake, you're doing all this stuff now. What's that going to do with the panels? What's that going to do with this? The sky isn't falling. When we bring this into Photoshop, what's going to happen is we're just going to have more beautiful data to work with, and we might have to do a little bit less work because we've already done a lot of the hard work on the front end. These profiles are great for working in a batch of images that you all want to look very similar. You want to do the work once, get it done, and then you have that batch profile that you can use on many different images. That's the real benefit of this. So then people say, well, can this work with black and white also? It can. So what you've seen here is me basically doing the same thing that I would do with my intelligent profile and presets, the Chroma edition. In the Chroma edition, though, I have a ton of different ones that just explore very specific colors to help you with color separation. I also have another profile pack called IP Profiles and Presets Noir, and in that package, it's all about the black and white process, and it breaks all this stuff down. So let me show you how to do this for a black and white image. So we'll say done on that one for now. Let me go into example number 3, and this is going to be our black and white photo that we're going to use. This image already begs to be black and white. It's kind of an overcast day looking towards this mountain, shooting at about 250 millimeters, pretty far telephoto distance away. Again, I'm going to start with the auto button. What you'll notice here is that it does have a hint of blue in there. But, I just want to start this with no color at all anyway. So once we press auto, I'm going to press open. That's going to bring us right here into Photoshop. So you'll notice that when I'm making profiles, it's very simple. Open the raw file I want to work on, set it to auto. That's my one constant that is actually a variable, because auto is variable based on the image that you're using. But it is a constant because it helps me develop profiles that could possibly work along multiple types of images, because the only variable that I have to begin with is the fact that I set it to auto, which in some cases is a constant, but it's a constant variable. Now I'm making this even nerdier and more challenging, but let's do this. What I'm going to do here, the first thing, because I know I want this to be black and white, I'm going to put a gradient map on here. Okay. And this is set to black to white, but it's in reverse. So let me just reverse this. So it's actually set to black and white. Now, this is set to smooth. I don't like that. Let's just change it to classic. I think that gives us the best starting point for a black and white. So we'll set that to classic. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build up a series of adjustment layers underneath this that could then help me create a black and white, a strong, dramatic black and white starting point. So the first thing, one of the things I've been using quite a bit lately to modify my tones for my profiles that I didn't use in the past is selective color, because in selective color, I can really work the tones in our whites, our neutrals, and our blacks with these sliders pretty well. And with this, I don't need to adjust any of the color in here. I mean, it can give you a little bit more because it is underneath a black and white adjustment layer. So as you modify these, you will see more color come out underneath. But because we're working in black and white, for this, I'm really just going to be working with the tonal adjustment here. So with those whites, I'm going to make them a little bit darker, okay, because white can get out of control pretty easily. And then I'm going to go into the neutrals. And with the neutrals, I'm just going to bump them up a little bit so that they're a little bit more dramatic. And then with the blacks, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to drop them down so they aren't quite as dark. I want them to be opened up. Even if I do this and you say, well, Blake, now you've crushed those blacks completely. There is an adjustment in Adobe Camera Raw that can actually help me recover that. So that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to purposely pull the black down to make them kind of crush like that, so they're almost like a mid-tone value and aren't pure black, because I'll show you where you can rescue that. And it also works for your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows. Okay, so that's a good teaching moment here. I will keep that low just for this purpose of this video. Now, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to pop into the curve. And in this curve, I want to use a curve that is going to accentuate the darks, the lights, and the midtones specifically for this image. So I'm going to brighten this up a little bit in those dark areas, darken it down a little bit in those midtones, and then brighten it up a little bit in those whites. And you see that kind of created this really beautiful cascading light of white around there, because we're telling our midtones to stay neutral while increasing our lights to pull them away from the neutrals and then pulling away our darks from there as well. Again, this selective color adjustment layer with this black is really not doing us any favors right now, but I'm going to keep it that way for the sake of the tutorial, because I want to show you how you can recover that in any black and white image that you make, because this will happen to you. So it's actually more important that we do this now, because what I'm going to teach you when we get into Adobe Camera Raw is going to be very helpful. All right, now let's put another curves adjustment layer on here just to make this a little bit more rounded off. I'm going to make the darks a little bit darker, okay? Even though they aren't going to go to complete darkness because of that selective color, and then pop up our lights a little bit. So this is going to give me a really dramatic starting point for a black and white image. And even if we turn the black and white off, this is essentially what we have here. We have the blue color is actually coming out now because of all the work that we've done with these adjustment layers. But let's go ahead and we'll go to File, we'll go to Export, and we're going to go to Lookup Tables, Color Lookup Tables. So I'm going to call this EX.3, and that's going to be Drama BW, because it's pretty dramatic. I'm going to press Control A or Command A to copy all that, Command or Control C to copy that. Okay, Command or Control V to paste it. All right. So now I'm actually going to open up two images from that same evening, or morning, I should say. I'm going to open up both of these so you can see how this black and white image could work on two different versions in the same location. So now we have to make our profile. We go over to our presets. Even though it's black and white, we are not going to press the B and W button, okay? I'm going to go ahead and go into the presets, press Alt or Option, and I'm going to press Control V to paste that in there. This is going into our Unlocking Raw group. I only wanted to have the Adobe standard profile in there. And then the color lookup table I'm going to use is going to be this Drama Black and White. Now, this Drama Black and White, there's a way that you can set it so that the slider doesn't work at all, which I'll show you that as well. But we'll set it to Adobe RGB for now. You could change this to 100 as the minimum, 100 as the maximum, and 100 as the amount. And then nobody would be able to use a slider for this. There's another way that you can actually turn that off completely. But we don't want to use a slider on this, because if we do, what could end up happening is it'll incorporate color into the image, and I don't really like that. Now, there's also this other way where you can make this maybe 50%, where when you move it to the left, it will make it a little washed out. So that could be a cool look that you like too. So we'll press OK, leave that at 50%, and then we'll go over to our Unlocking Raw, example number 3. And we have our dramatic black and white. Look at that as a starting point. Isn't that amazing? So we can't take it any higher. It won't go up any higher. But as we move it down, it will get reduced if you do want that for some reason. Okay. Now, I did say that if you don't want this in here at all, you don't want this to basically have any slider at all, you can change it so that the slider won't appear. And there's also some other important settings in there that we're going to change. So I'm going to press Alt or Option, and then press and hold right click, and then go to Rename Profile. Again, we're unlocking things that you wouldn't normally be able to unlock because this applicability stuff is not going to be in there if you just go to rename the file by itself. So it's in this group, Unlocking Raw. When you see Model here, I want to change this to any image from anywhere. So any image that's pulled in, doesn't matter if it's an Adobe RAW file, an Adobe standard profile, doesn't matter if it's a Sony image, it doesn't matter what camera it comes from, I want it to be able to use it. Let's say I don't want to be able to use this on just RAW images. I want to also use it on JPEGs. I'm going to do RAW and non-RAW images. And I want to limit this to color or monochrome images. That way, any image that's pulled up into Adobe Camera or Lightroom, this profile will work on. If you have it set to Sony ILC, guess what? This will only work. You will only even see it if you have a Sony A1 camera. Okay, so we don't want that to be set that way because we want this to be universal for everybody. And then we press OK. All right, so now this is set up so we can use it on any image. You can do the same thing for these ones. Press Alt or Option and hold it, right click, and Rename Profile will get you into that screen again. Again, we could change this so that it's images from anywhere, RAW or non-RAW, and then color and monochrome. We'll press OK. And then again, right click on this one, do the same thing on this one, Rename Profile. I want this to be for, this is just going to help me because then I don't have to do it when I save this out for you. RAW and non-RAW images, and then color and monochrome, and then press OK. Oh, and the amount slider. Alt or Option, Rename Profile. If you just want to get rid of the amount slider altogether, which is probably a good idea for black and white ones, just click this and there will no longer be an amount slider underneath this, so you can't move it. Okay, it's just going to be this dramatic black and white image. Now, if we go back to the beginning here, everything we move in here is going to move at a very dramatic way. And the reason why is because that LUT profile on top is controlling all those tonal values as they change underneath. And look at how magical these black and white images can get because you did the hard work on the front end. Oh my gosh, I get so passionate about this stuff. It's so good. So color grading is the one thing that when you do anything with, and the other beautiful part about this is because we did this, if we go into the color mixer, we now have access to hue, saturation, and luminance of every color that would be in this image. Now we know that this image is almost void of color anyway, so it doesn't really matter much. But if we change this to Adobe's black and white method, you only get the luminance for every color. So we've kind of hacked Adobe Camera Raw right now to believe that this is a regular profile and it's not a black and white image. It's almost like it's being tricked. It's kind of cool how that works. Even though the black and white button is on here, we can still access things that we wouldn't normally have access to. Now, the one thing that I did say that could help you with a black and white image where we have faded colors, or sorry, faded tonal values, is color grading. And that's because color grading exists on top of the raw profile. Okay, so what happens here is I get a little bit more control over my shadows. Okay, I can bring that down and make those shadows a little bit more, have a little bit more depth. In my midtones, I can bring this up and make them a little bit brighter. In my lights, I can bring that up and make them a little bit more bright as well. So color grading in this case is actually really awesome for black and white images to modify what's come in after you made your own black and white lookup table profile. So I'll click on this image and we'll see what happens here. I'll go ahead and go into Unlocking Raw and I will change this to our dramatic black and white, and it's not going to look good at first, but once we press that auto button, look at that variable and how it comes through there. It looks great. Now again, our blacks don't look that great, so maybe if I bring them down a little bit, we can see some detail in there and bring the contrast up a little bit. But this is really where color grading is going to come in, and we're going to need a little bit more of that shadow to come through there and become a little bit darker. But at the same time, we might need our midtones to come up and become a little bit brighter. These blacks are going to be very dark in these areas. It made a very dramatic image for this one, but when you have a lot of very dark areas here, you're going to have to kind of play around with what happens with the exposure in the image, specifically in those dark areas with this specific profile. And that's just one of those things to know, that you're not always going to get 100% perfect profile for every single image that you bring in, even images that are from the same scene, because it really is going to depend on the tonal value that's present in those images. Age-old question I get all the time. Blake, do you use linear profiles? My answer, yes, but not in the way that most of you do. I'm not going to explain linear profiles because I could be here for another 45 minutes doing so. There's somebody else in the industry that has done a great job of explaining linear profiles, and that's Tony Kuiper. I'm giving him that respect because he gives me a lot of respect in regards to color and even puts my name on some of his buttons in his panel, which I really, truly appreciate. So if you want to learn about how to make a really good linear profile, you're going to want to look up Tony Kuiper linear profiles, and he's already done a lot of the hard work for you. So in this case, I'm not going to go over the basis of how to make a linear profile. He's done a great job of doing all of that. No sense in recreating the wheel. But I will show you how I use linear profiles. And the way I use them is not the way most people do. It's more of a problematic case for me. Like this image, perfect example. Lots of dynamic range here going from area of highest highlight to darkest dark. This is an image where I could have possibly done an HDR merge on this, but there still wasn't enough dynamic range in the scene to do that. But you'll see here, I don't have a whole lot in my midtones. I'm pegged on my darks. I'm almost pegged on my lights, and I've captured what I could for the best exposure for this scene. Now, a linear profile comes in because it cuts this highlight curve that's built and baked into any raw file that comes directly from your manufacturer. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into it. Tony Kuiper has done a phenomenal job. But what I will do is I will set this up with one of my linear profiles, which is just the basic Sony A1 linear profile. What you can see now is that it cuts that light a little bit. This is great for problematic images, especially problematic highlights. But in my opinion, linear profiles become problematic in that they wash everything out. Yes, we have our highlights that can now be seen, but look at our midtones and our darks. It just looks horrible. If I press auto, I'm constantly fighting against the fact that I just used a linear profile here to try and fix the highlights. And then I'm constantly chasing my tail to get better contrast in the image using all my sliders to try and do so. So this is how I use linear profiles. I will make my image a linear profile just like this. I'll press open to get that opened up into Photoshop. And then once I have this set, let's say we make a brightness and contrast. Perfect example. I'll come in here and move this contrast so I get more contrast specifically in the midtones and the darks here that got kind of washed out in the process of adding that linear profile on there. Now in the brightness, I might want to bring that down a little bit so that we don't see a whole lot of that. And I don't want that to be in the foreground. So I really only want that brightness to be affecting the highlights. So this is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to have to zero this one out. And I'm going to make sure that this brightness contrast is only for my midtones and my shadows. So with that case, I can bring the brightness up because this is only going to be for my midtones and my shadows. Okay. And I can bring the contrast up. Now, how do I know this is only going to be for my midtones and my shadows? Well, if I go into my blend diff panel and I say only darks, it's only going to have this apply to the darkest dark areas as they transition into my midtones and slowly taper off as they go outside of my midtones and into my highlights. Okay, again, super nerdy stuff. Now I'm going to go into another brightness contrast. Now you could use curves for this, but brightness and contrast these days is actually pretty good for this. I'm going to go ahead and drop the brightness. This is really only going to be for the highlights, and increase the amount of contrast in those highlights. For this, go into my blend diff panel and say only the highlights. Okay, so now this is only going to affect the highlights. This is only going to affect the darks. This is actually rather strong, so I'm going to drop the opacity here because I already have things kind of set up for me. That is actually going to be a better starting point for me than this, okay? So now I'm going to save this out specifically with linear somewhere in the name. So I'll go to File, Export, Export, and then Color Lookup Tables. I'm going to name this one EX.4. And we're going to call this linear contrast. Now, this is one of those things that if you're a linear profile user, you're going to have to do this one on your own. I can't really help you with this one because what I'm using here is a color lookup table that is then going to be placed on top of a linear profile. And I'm not going to give you the lookup table because I really truly want you to experiment with this because it's not going to be the same for every image, and it's definitely not going to be the same for every camera that has a linear profile. So if you are an Elite member, you're going to see examples 1, 2, and 3 as profiles that you can use in the Unlocking RAW. You will not see example number 4, unless of course you have a Sony A1. Then you will, because I'm going to save it in there. And you're going to see how these things kind of work. If you do or don't, it doesn't really matter. Because if you are going to use your own camera, use Tony Kuiper's process on how to get your linear profile in there, and then use this process on how to exploit that linear profile a little bit more. So I'm going to press OK. I'm going to save this as, what did I say, EX.4. 4, and that's going to be linear contrast. See, if I don't Control C, Control V, I have to do it myself. So Control C, Control A to copy, Control A to highlight all, Control C to copy, and then I'll paste that one to make the profile. So I'm going to double click this. It's not going to look like this here because of all the stuff that we did here. So what I'm going to do is it's set to A1 linear profile, because remember, what gets included in the recording of this? The linear profile does. So I'm going to go over to my presets, Alt or Option, click on the new preset, and I'm going to take the basic settings off of this. This, you see here, camera profile is A1 linear profile. Change the name, and then change the location to unlocking raw. Color lookup table, I want to use this one where I saved it to, Adobe RGB, and I will leave my minimum and maximum at 0 and 200, and then I'll press OK. So now when I go into my profiles, because the A1 profile has been baked into this one, you'll see it in my unlocking raw. Now, if you are not an A1 user, you will not see this in this grouping. I'm going to repeat that again. You're going to have to go through the process of making your own linear profiles and then doing this for your own linear profiles. This is ultra nerd level, okay? So this is for the ultra nerds that are daring enough to do so. Now with the amount here, look at that. I can get a lot. Look at that. That's using A1 linear data with more contrast on top. So now, as I work with this, look at the level of control I get even on a linear profile type of image. Now, I didn't even do anything with the color, did I? No, I didn't. But I could have also added any one of those other things in there, like selective color or anything else that I wanted to into that to get the look and feel that I wanted as my base to start with for this image. This starting point versus Adobe Color. Okay, you see the difference now. Look at the highlights up there. Okay, this is not a finished image by any stretch of the imagination. This is just a raw file. I would process this a lot more. I'd bring it into Photoshop and process it a lot more. I'm not trying to get you to a point where you're taking your raw files and making finished images at Adobe Camera Raw. You very well could if you'd like to, but just know that there's so much power inside of Photoshop that could really take all of these images to the next level. What I'm showing you here is just that there is more possibility for you at the raw level that will blow your mind if you take the time to experiment with it. This is really just a snippet out of all the stuff that I teach in my Intelligent Profiles and Presets Chroma and Noir profile packs. But I don't think people spend enough time in that section in the course. And the reason why is because so many people ask me, do I use profiles? If you watch that stuff, if you truly watch that stuff, you would know that I do. I just use them in a different way than most people do. And I don't use them when I'm doing big workflow things in an online event experience. Why? Because if I use this stuff without you having the knowledge, that alienates you and immediately starts the workflow with, well, Blake's doing something I don't even know how to do. So I don't even know how to even start. Well, now you know, okay? And really for me, it is so generic the way I use these profiles, but it's also a very powerful way. And there are times when I'm bored that I'm like, I wonder if I can make the best profile ever made so that when I bring in every one of my images, they always look superb. I've been trying this for years now, and I'm getting pretty close. This is my experiments that I'm sharing with you. And like I said, it's really nerdy, but you're diving into the color, you're diving into the science behind a lot of what's happening in the background that you don't even realize is happening. And this is where you unlock some serious power when you know. That guy is right. There's some serious power there. Lots of power. Oh my gosh. A lot of people are, I don't even know. Like usually the chat is like going crazy. I got lots of questions. I don't have a whole lot of that right now. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask. I will answer whatever I can. John says he's, it looks like he might be drooling over this. Can't wait to get his teeth into it. I think the same. It's one of those things where, you think you know something, and then something else comes around, and now you know a little bit more. And I've taught this many times in, like I said, my Chroma profile course, my Noir profile course. Both of those courses teach you how to do this at this level, and they're a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical because it's packaged up in a course and it's not a live event, and you have the ability to pause and keep going and stuff. So like I said, if you're an F64 Elite member, you can actually go on F64 Elite right now, and on the main page or the live event archive, you're going to see the live events already available. The replay is already available. The Q&A isn't on there yet. You can see up in the top of the chat that is your link. If you are not an F64 Elite member, that is your link up there where you can watch the replay again. If you're an F64 Elite member, the 4 profiles that I created, I did package up and put them on F64 Elite for you. You are free to install those into your version of Adobe Camera Raw to see if they will help you and work with you. They may not. I want you to know that. I want you to realize that sometimes these profiles are very specific to the images that we make them for, because not all tones are the same and not all colors are the same. That's why we process our images in the first place. But if you do this in a generic way and you don't push the stuff too far in your adjustment layers in Photoshop, you can really create some very powerful things. I promise you that. So powerful that I was able to make 3 courses on this concept that many people have purchased and are using right now in their workflow. So it's one of those things that it is powerful. You're going to have to experiment on your own. You will never understand the extent of the power of these raw profiles until you get your hands dirty and you try to make some on your own. Okay. So I implore you, try it. You cannot break anything. And it's not like the darkroom where you might say, well, this is a lot of work for all this stuff. You know, when I worked in the darkroom, I used to have to roll my own film, take my pictures, take the film out of the camera, put them in a little special canister, process the film. Then I had to make a contact sheet from that film. Then I had to take that contact sheet, decide which image was going to be the best because most of them were crap, lots of red marks all over the place. Then I had to take that negative, put it under the enlarger, put the paper underneath it, put the light onto the paper, then take that paper, then process that image through all the different baths of chemicals, then put it in a rinse bath, then let it dry. And wow, we had ourselves an image. You know how long it took to experiment with one photograph in the darkroom? Hours. Okay, this could take you minutes. And if it doesn't work, okay, great, move on. But if it does work, guess what? You're going to be set on fire. I know you're going to be set on fire because it sets me on fire. So, David H says, as usual, complete mind blower in a good way. No wonder it's gone a bit quiet. It was very quiet in the chat today. Love you guys, but hey, you know, you didn't make my life as fun as it usually is during these live events. John D says he loves to experiment. Lana says, I'm really trying to understand what the ultimate use of profiles like this are. The ultimate use of profiles like this is basically just, it really comes down to if you have a problematic image that you want to be able to help, or you want access to things that you don't have access to in Adobe Camera Raw at the raw level that you would normally have access to in Photoshop. I look at it like this way. It's like, okay, I've got a Jeep, right? And this Jeep has a 4-cylinder turbo in it. And while it functions perfectly well, as it did by itself, my sons and I wanted it to be a little bit beefier. So what did we do? We put some exhaust on it to make it sound a little grittier. Not annoying, but just make it sound a little bit grittier. We put a blow-off valve in the engine to make the kind of sound happen when the engine took off and broke. Then we put a cold air intake in it to make the turbo more efficient. Now, did the turbo need all of that stuff? No, because it didn't come stock in the Jeep. But when we put that stuff in there, did we get more performance out of the Jeep when we did it? Absolutely. And we had a lot of fun in the process. It was a way for my sons and I to bond over building the Jeep. So the way I kind of bring that to you when it comes to photographs is that you may never need to do this. The engine in your image may be perfectly fine, and you may be 100% okay with the engine that's in your raw files right now. But for those of you that want more, for those of you that want the grit, for those of you that want the power, that's what this is for. That's exactly what this is for. So, yeah, hope that helped. I'm going to go ahead and log off. Oh, before I log off, just a reminder for F64 Elite members, next week, next Thursday, I believe it is. Yep, it is next Thursday. We have our roundtable where we're going to have kind of an open forum roundtable. Last month, we did a image critique, or not image critique, an image edit session. This time, we're going to go back to our normal roundtable function where we just kind of meet, have fun, and talk. And then we'll be ranking up things for your June 1st stuff, your critique sessions, your Photoshop tip that's exclusive for Elite members. So if you aren't an Elite member and you're watching this, Elite members get a lot of stuff, okay? You might think, well, what's Blake up to these days? I'm doing a lot of stuff for Elite members because they do a lot of stuff for me. So I appreciate you guys. Oh, wait, David P. says, is a black and white profile better than your black and white action or two different animals? Two different animals. And you can actually I believe you can, yes, you can use my black and white action to create a profile as well. I didn't want to make things more confusing than they already were, but yes, it's just different. Some people want to do the black and white at the raw level. I don't like to do black and white at the raw level, but I put that out there because I know some people do like to do black and white at the raw level. I prefer to do black and white in Photoshop, but it was put there because to explain some higher level concepts. What was the third product? I'm not sure what you mean, John D, about the third product, but there are some links. If you are interested in those courses, there are some links on the replay page of where you can learn about IP Chroma and Noir, and there's also a coupon code there if you want to get like a 40% discount on top of that. So that's all there on the replay page, and I'm going to be sending your replay out tomorrow morning. I got to boogie out and do some work this afternoon, so I'm not going to have time to send your replay out to you this evening, but I will send it out in the morning. So you'll see the replay with my normal Friday email that you usually get. So, all right. There's a lot going on there. Make sure you watch the replay because you will find a lot of value in that, I'm sure, versus the first go through. That way you can pause, you can slow things down, and you can really make this work for you. So if you have any questions about it, you can email me, Blake at f64academy.com. But I will say that there's a lot of gremlins that could appear in this. So make sure you just follow what I'm doing to the letter and you should be okay. All right. All right. You guys have a great one. I will see F64 Elite members next week. Love you all and have a great weekend.